Hi everyone. So this video topic is going to be a little bit interesting, but it's going to be about the argument people have of waiting till marriage and that whole thing and whether or not waiting till marriage is a good idea. A lot of the arguments that I hear from people are you shouldn't wait until marriage because what if you're not compatible with the person? You shouldn't wait until marriage because things will be awkward and nobody wants things to be awkward on their wedding day or nobody wants things to be awkward when they get married. And I'm a proponent for people getting married when they both have the confirmation from God to get married. That's it. I don't think that there should be a specific time of how long people should date. When I was younger, I felt that way. When I was younger, because I understood the world's definition of love and relationships. I understood what the world said, and the world said that you should get to know somebody and figure out what you like and figure out what you want. And so I thought that dating was an experiment rather than something that we do with intention and that we test the fruit of, right? I thought it was about what you wanted and how you felt and passion and all these different things that the world tells us that love and relationships are about, and they're absolutely not. They're about integrity, they're about commitment, they're about fulfilling the will of God for your life, they're about accountability and forgiveness. And the relationship between a man and a wife has a very specific purpose in the will of God, right? So we get confused because the world teaches us that it's supposed to be about dating, it's supposed to be about feeling good, it's supposed to be about figuring out what each other likes, it's supposed to be about making each other feel good, and those things can be really confusing because what it does is it creates this environment where people have to perform in marriage and relationships. It creates this whole thing where if I'm in a marriage with you, I'm supposed to know how to love you better than anybody else. I'm supposed to know all the things that make you feel good. I'm supposed to do all these different things. And therefore, instead of focusing on the intention of a relationship or the growth process of becoming one, I think that I'm already supposed to reap the benefits of becoming one with my person, with my husband, instead of actually the process of it. This woman was explaining to me that since she and her now husband have waited until marriage, there's things that they're now discovering because they're married and how it's made things awkward and how they're struggling in their marriage as a result of it. And I remember having this conversation with her, and I said, is it possible that that was God's intention for us? That was the process of becoming one? That it's supposed to be awkward, and there's supposed to be things that you have to figure out. And it's not supposed to be perfect right away, and it's not supposed to be a performance, but rather it's two people who are becoming one, which means that they're separate bodies and that they're coming together so that they can learn each other. And that process takes time, and that the awkwardness comes from you trying to put the world's perceptions of dating, love, romance, and physical intimacy into your marriage, which is a godly institution. Maybe the awkwardness doesn't come from the fact that you both don't know what you're doing, because I think that that's to be expected. I think the awkwardness comes from the fact that you're comparing your relationship to the world's version of a relationship. The difference between a worldly relationship and God's relationship, though, the one that God intends for us, is that everything with God builds up. Everything with God is a journey and a process. The things with the world is get everything fast and fall fast. That's why you have people who have these drawn out, passionate relationships, and then they end up reaching this amount of passion, and it's a fairy tale land, and they don't deal with issues, and they're not knowing anything about each other, and everything's just high, and then they crash and they don't know how to come back up from that. Is it possible that God's love is slow and steady, not fast and passionate? Is it possible that God's love is about relation and connection and not about performance? It's so funny how the world tells us to think about things. Because now this woman feels like there's a problem in her marriage because her and her husband are still figuring each other out. 6 years into marriage. And she thinks that the problem stems from the fact that they waited until marriage. She feels like now they're dating when they should be married. Isn't it possible that dating is an attempt by the enemy to pervert marriage? And I'm not saying dating is a sin, right? Because that's the world we live in nowadays. We have to date now. That is normal. We have to date. We have to take the time to get to know people, because nobody meets anyone and then just jumps into marriage unless it's an arranged marriage situation or people feel led by God to do that. Most people nowadays on average date 2 years. That's a statistical fact before they get married. But is it possible that because the world has convoluted this idea of marriage and they've extrapolated the pieces they like from marriage and said, let me just give you little doses of what a marriage would represent in the dating phase to see if you like it or not with this person, so that you can bounce around to other people and figure out what feels the best, that you feel that your marriage or your relationship is going to be doomed because you're comparing it to the world? Sure, couples who have dated a long time and have done everything before marriage seem to know each other a little bit better when they get married. But is it possible, because in the eyes of God, that they didn't get married when they signed a marriage contract? That they've been performing marriage for years. They just actually made it official when they signed a contract and went before God to the world. I want us to stop as Christians comparing how things should be according to the world's definition of it, because then we'll think something's wrong when it's really God's intention and God's plan all along. Maybe marriages are more fruitful when people wait, because instead of you rushing for everything and giving your heart to find out that something's not going to work out, then you get to the place in a relationship where you get married to this person and now you get to discover them and date them without the inhibitions of waiting until marriage. Maybe God's design is meant that way on purpose. I don't know. That doesn't sound like a bad deal to me. It doesn't sound like a bad deal to me to assess the character of a person without doing marriage related things, such as moving in or spending too much time together, or, not waiting until marriage to explore physical intimacy and actually having a genuine friendship with this person. And then when we get married, we have access to all the things that relationships are supposed to have, which is romance and physical intimacy and all that other stuff. The world has perverted you as a Christian into thinking that your marriage is failing because it doesn't look like the world's version of a marriage, when really it's a beautiful thing. Do you know how many people get divorced because they say their marriages have gone cold, or it's stale, or they're not in love with their partner anymore, or they're in a boring cycle? But because you waited until marriage to be able to unleash the best parts of a relationship, now you get to discover that all over again. How much more fruitful and exciting and interesting will your marriage be, because now you get to do it without the inhibitions of sin, without soul ties, without all these other experiences that you're comparing your marriage to, because you did things the way that God called us to do it. And hey, you may have made a mistake in the past, but you can still do things God's way. You can submit your relationship to God, and God may break it apart. God may do some healing, but at the end of the day, now God's in control, and that's all that matters. But if you want to have a godly marriage, then do things according to the way of God. The things of God take time. It's not a jump into a situation and you get all the fruits immediately, and then the fruits fizzle out, so now you got to go somewhere else to get excitement, because you didn't learn how to build discipline before you were married and set boundaries before you were married. I don't know. I just found it so funny that this married woman was feeling like her marriage is struggling because she did things the right way. She and her husband did things the right way, and now they have to essentially date and marriage, and that's supposed to be a bad thing. This just shows us how far we are away from God's purpose and plan for humankind. Because so many people think that there's all these things that need to happen. I need to test the water before I know if I want to jump in the pool. And so because you haven't tested the waters, and because you're not looking like a worldly couple, you think your marriage is wrong. I think innocence is a beautiful thing. And I think the ability to discover and to build new and to find out what works for you in your marriage is a beautiful thing. So many people have been robbed of these experiences, of the ability to discover, because they jump into relationships having to perform. I'm assuming what a wife is supposed to do. I'm assuming what a good person in this area is supposed to do. I'm assuming this is what it means to be into my husband. I'm assuming, and it's not a natural discovery. We're trying to do things the world's way and then put God's stamp of approval on it. If you're someone who's waiting till marriage and you're listening to these voices in your head that what if I'm going to be inexperienced, because a lot of people do, and you're not There's nothing wrong with it, of you thinking that way, because you were taught to think that way. Let me rephrase that differently, because you shouldn't think that way. There's nothing wrong if you have fallen to the temptation of thinking that way, because it wasn't your fault. The world taught you to think that way. But coming to the knowledge of God and the awareness of God, that this was God's design all along. His design wasn't for you to test drive multiple people to figure out what you like. That is a sinful and worldly way of figuring things out. And I'm not saying dating itself is a sinful thing. But there are so many people I know, young men, who say, I meet a lot of great, qualified, godly women, but I'm not interested in them. I don't like any of them. Oh yeah, they'd be a great wife one day. I just don't feel like I should be with them. And they're constantly dating people and constantly giving their heart to people and constantly pulling away. And I know a lot of women who do the same. And they always end up stuck in these places. And I'm like, how much longer do you think you can continue to give aspects of yourself that were designed for marriage to other people? People tend to take it as far as physical intimacy. Oh, if we do physical stuff, then that's when. No. You're not supposed to emotionally connect to multiple people and then all of a sudden cut them off and not talk to them anymore because you guys are no longer together. It's not normal for you to keep changing friend groups and friend circles and who you spend your time on and dedicate and pour years into people to separate from them because they decide they don't want to marry you or you decide you don't want to marry them. It's not normal behavior. God didn't intend for us to build connections to people to constantly rip apart. So when we look at the world and we think there's something wrong with people doing things the way God intended us to do it because we're so used to the perverted version of it, that's when we as Christians have to search our hearts. There's nothing wrong with having to discover your husband and figure out, you know what, we didn't spend a lot of time together when we were dating because we tried to set boundaries. So now that we live together, I get to learn you. I get to see your natural habitat. I get to see how you operate. We have some things to compromise on, but isn't it beautiful that we get to work out things and we get to do it in the safety of the covenant of God? So I don't have to worry about if I'm sinning or when I'm going to kick you out of my apartment because things are going to go too far, or if I don't have to worry about those things. I'm not saying it means your marriage is going to be perfect because you waited until marriage to explore physical intimacy or to date a certain way. I'm not saying that at all. People are going to have issues. People are going to have sins that they have to overcome. People can still bring lust issues into your marriage, even if you have waited until marriage. Because the world is filled with lust. So we have all these perverted ways of thinking about love and relationships that have nothing to do with the will of God. But there's a lot more safety when you understand that marriage is a discovery and not meant to be a performance. That it's not a destination that you reach, but it's a process of two becoming one. So in that process, there's going to be some growth, some things you're going to grow into, and some things you're going to grow out of. So hopefully this was encouraging to anybody that is trying to wait or anyone who has been discouraged from waiting, because this comes up a lot, that you're making the wrong decision or that you might sabotage your relationship by waiting until marriage. And that is a lie from the enemy to convince you to keep extrapolating parts of marriage that God designed to be enjoyed in marriage, which is dating and comfort and being around someone without having to worry about creating all these boundaries and roadblocks so you don't fall into sin and temptation. And you get to just enjoy and be and submit things to God. For those who are struggling with that because the world has told you that that looks wrong, and you're comparing your marriage and what looks like fun to the marriage of the world, hopefully you are encouraged. Hopefully you're encouraged and you know that there's safety in doing it God's way. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope to talk with all of you soon. Love you and God bless.